Today, we have an honor and privilege to have as our guest, Professor Robert C. Holub, America's leading scholar of 19th and 20th century German intellectual, cultural, and literary history, an expert on Heine and Nietzsche, chair of Department of German Studies in Ohio State University, and author of many books, including Nietzsche's Jewish Problem, between Anti-Semitism and Anti-Judaism. Professor, welcome to Chicago Jewish Cafe.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Professor, a long time ago, I've heard the name Nietzsche, and in my mind, and in context that I heard, it was associated as one of the leading philosophers of Nazism in Germany. A while back, I also noticed that Nietzsche has a lot of interesting, positive things to say about Jews. And one of the reasons that you're here is to explain to us, to people like me, what is the difference between Nietzsche that I've heard about and Nietzsche that I just came across a few years ago. Seems to me that Nietzsche that I've heard about more recently is the guy who not only does not hate Jews, but says things about our people that very few other people say. Could you please let me know what was so attractive to Nazis about Nietzsche first?
Well, you know, the way that you put it, that was the reason that I wrote the book, because it is a complex issue, and it's apt to be complicated by the reception history of Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a favorite philosopher of many people in the Third Reich, but not all. He was rejected by some people because in the Third Reich, because he was not an ardent nationalist in his writings. In fact, he said many things against Germany, and he was against anti-Semitism as it was defined in his time. So that his reputation stems largely from the kinds of people that you were reading who classified him as the Nazis' favorite philosopher. And that goes not only for the German scene and for Hitler, who also praised Nietzsche, but also for Crane Brinton, for example, the Harvard philosopher who wrote a book on Nietzsche during the 40s and classified him as an anti-Semite. Now, could Nietzsche be classified as an anti-Semite? Well, there's kind of circumstantial evidence that connects him with anti-Semitism in his times. He was associated with Richard Wagner. Wagner very definitely wrote anti-Jewish texts and made anti-Jewish remarks. I think there's no doubt that he was a leading voice in the anti-Semitic movement of the late 19th century, and taken as so, and often cited by other people who were anti-Semites. So Nietzsche was associated with Wagner for at least the first 6 years of his writing, let's say up until 1878, and then he broke with Wagner, but that wasn't widely known that he broke with Wagner. I think he was still associated with the Wagner circle, with the extended Wagner circle. Most of the people who bought his books and who talked about Nietzsche were in Wagner's circle, so he was still associated with them. And the second thing is that his brother-in-law, Bernhard Förster, the man who married his sister Elisabeth, he was a leader of the anti-Semitic movement. He was an author of the anti-Semitic petition in 1881, and established a colony actually in Paraguay called Nueva Germania in order to get away from Jewified Europe and Jewified Germany. So he was a big anti-Semite and known as a big anti-Semite. A third reason Nietzsche might have been associated with anti-Semitism is that his publisher, Ernst Schmeitzner, was a leader of the anti-Semitic movement in Saxony. Nietzsche often complained about Schmeitzner not paying as much attention to his works as he should, because he was too busy doing anti-Semitic propaganda and publishing anti-Semitic texts. But nonetheless, people knew that Nietzsche was being published by Ernst Schmeitzner. Schmeitzner was an anti-Semite. His brother-in-law was an anti-Semite. He was associated with Wagner in the extended Wagner circle. It seems Nietzsche was probably an anti-Semite too. That was kind of the take on Nietzsche. Now, the positive remarks that you note are made mostly in aphoristic works. In his early works, he doesn't mention Jews very much, because he was warned by the Wagners not to mention them that much, not to take on the Jews, and so he didn't. But there are enough references that are obvious reference to anti-Semitic tropes that I think everybody recognized him as part of Wagner's anti-Semitic cohort in the 1870s. In his aphoristic works, which come after that, he has quite a number of aphorisms. Well, quite a number is maybe too much, but he has a half dozen or so aphorisms where he makes positive remarks about the Jews. Whether he made these positive remarks about the Jews because he believed them, whether he became philo-Semitic or not, or whether he wanted to offend Wagner, which was still something that he wanted to do because he had broken with Wagner, is really an open question. But he did make these positive remarks, and I think that those are probably the remarks that are quoted most by people who see that he is, or who want to portray him as a philo-Semite, let's say. In his later period, however, when he deals with morality in the Beyond Good and Evil and the Genealogy of Morals, he very definitely places the Jews and Judaism at the beginning of what he calls and the foundation of slave morality or herd morality. Not a very flattering place for Judaism to be placed. And that was something that also the Nazi Nietzsche fans picked up and said, see, everything that's gone wrong in Western society because of slave morality that we've had originates with the Jews. So there's a very mixed picture of Nietzsche and his relationship to Judaism during his life, and that gets picked up by various people later on. Now, there's one other issue, and that is the issue of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has come to mean hatred of, dislike for the Jews in general. It's the wrong term, as we all recognize, because the Semites were a larger linguistic group that included many Arabs. So the term was the wrong term, but nonetheless, it became the term very quickly to mean hatred and hostility toward the Jews. Now, in Nietzsche's time, though, there was a very specific referent to it for anti-Semitism, because it had just risen in Germany in 1880. That is, in 1875, there was no anti-Semitism. Well, there was anti-Semitism in that generic sense, but there was no one was talking about anti-Semitism because there wasn't a word for it. Being anti-Semitic in 1875 would have meant something like, you're against the Semitic languages or something like that. It wouldn't have meant that you were that you showed hostility toward Jews and Judaism. So Nietzsche was very much against the anti-Semitic movement of his time, not because he was necessarily pro-Jewish, but because he thought that that was the wrong kind of solution to the Jewish problem or the Jewish question that existed in Germany. So what we're talking about is the anti-Semites were a kind of a radical group, a kind of a mass movement type of group, which Nietzsche objected to. And they wanted Jews to be taken, to have their citizenship rights taken away, to be pushed out of the country, those kinds of things. Nietzsche wasn't in favor of that. He saw other solutions to the Jewish question, And his solutions mostly had to do with a very common trope in the 19th century, which was intermarriage. So the Jews, as he writes, as Nietzsche states in a number of places, they have repulsive traits that could be overcome if they would marry, for example, with Prussian officers. And then the Jewish inheritance, or part of the inheritance, would be dealing with money and financial things, which Jews are good at, again, using a kind of a stereotypical part of Judaism. And the Prussian officers would take care of the rest of being German and being able to deal with the world in a different sense. So that kind of intermarriage would then eliminate the negative characteristics of Jews, which Nietzsche felt definitely existed. So that I don't know if that clarifies for you everything, but
Professor, so far everything you said makes me think that my first impression of Nietzsche as one of the main ideologists of Nazism was correct.
Well, I wouldn't think so. I would disagree with that. I think that he was, I think it's very difficult for him to be an ideologue for Nazism, because he didn't live in those times. And what he would have done with National Socialism, or if he were recruited for National Socialism, is very difficult to say. He didn't like mass movements. He didn't like political parties. He may have been very much against Nazism for that reason alone, even if he
I have no doubt, given that the guy was very individualistic, all the way to the point of going crazy. and I don't think he would have been able to follow Führer in any way, shape, or form, and would be against it. He was against Germany. He was
That's right.
Europe.
That's right.
So there was many things, but that's not what I'm saying when I say that he is a founding stone of Nazism. What I mean is that his ideas sound to me like, from what I just heard, very much in congruence with the ideas of German Nazis.
I think if you pick and choose some things from Nietzsche, then you can find tropes and messages that resonate with National Socialism. But there are many other things in Nietzsche's writings that don't resonate with them, such as his hatred of the anti-Semites of his time, such as his dislike of German nationalism, and some of the favorable remarks that he does make about Jews and wanting to see them intermarry. That certainly isn't something that the Nazis would have advocated, and certainly the Nuremberg laws showed that they wanted to do away with any kind of intermarriage. So there are some things that I think could be picked up, and they were picked up by certain Nazi philosophers and ideologues that Nietzsche said. But then there were many, even among the Nazi philosophers, who were suspicious of Nietzsche, who felt that he wasn't nationalist enough, he wasn't consistently anti-Jewish enough, and so they distanced themselves from him.
As I understand, especially the last 20 years of his life. I mean, he went all the way against anti-Semites to such an extent that he actually broke his relationship with his beloved sister and her family.
To a certain extent. I mean,
because of the issue of anti-Semitism.
Right. It wasn't. Yes, that was part of it. I think part of it was that she married Förster and moved away with him to Paraguay. But Nietzsche's relationship with his sister is very complex and has not been portrayed accurately, I think, in the scholarship. He always remained very close to his sister. His sister was lived with him for a great deal of the time when he was in Basel as a professor. He wasn't married. She was more or less his wife. She took care of the household. She shared his thoughts with him. He talked to her about what he was doing. And so he was pretty close with her. And I think that her betrayal of him in a certain sense in marrying Förster, also in her abuse of Lou Salome when that relationship came up. I think that soured him against his sister to some degree, but he still harbored very close feelings for her. And he never broke with his mother. I mean, his mother wasn't an anti-Semite. He comes from a Protestant pastor's background. There's no evidence of anti-Semitism really in his youth or from his father. His father, of course, died when he was only 5 years old. But there's no evidence of a kind of an anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish education for him, although that was rampant in Germany and he could have picked that up. But when we look at his notebooks from his juvenilia, and we have 5 huge books of notes and things that he wrote, there's almost nothing that mentions something that is anti-Jewish. So he didn't really pick that up until he started as a student at Leipzig. When he started as a student at Leipzig, then he got in with a crowd that had these kind of cultural anti-Semitic things. They didn't like the fact that Jews were coming in for the Leipzig fairs and selling their goods and taking over rooms that students formerly had and things like that. And so he makes various remarks at that point. But before that point, which is, you know, we're dealing with 1867, 1868, before that point, we don't find anything from his family, including from his sister, of anti-Semitism. And if anyone introduced anti-Jewish remarks into the family, it was Nietzsche himself at that point. And that's where his sister picked that up first. She wasn't the original anti-Jewish person. It was Nietzsche with his Wagnerian connections that was the original that brought anti-Jewish thought into the Nietzsche family.
Very interesting. But still, I have a question about this period. I mean,
Please.
This is the period where Nietzsche basically forms his view of the world and view of Christianity, which he believes is the foundation of self-destruction of Europe.
Right.
And he blames Jews of the Second Temple as the source of Christianity and a source of this morality, as he says, of slaves. He does not blame Jews of the First Temple, that is the Jews that have produced prophets, writings of prophets. He blames Jews after Babylonian exile.
Mm-hmm.
And now I have to say, these are also my Jews.
Right. Well, I think Nietzsche's views on older Judaism, let's say, on the Hebrew tribes, were that they had a correct or a natural relationship with God. And that relationship was one of vengeance, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, those kinds of things. The God was the God of one people, not a universal God. So he objects to the universalization of the God and the moralization of religion. When it was just the God that this Hebrew tribe had, that was okay and in keeping with what was going on. That's a natural relationship to God, I think, is what he calls it, depending on the work of Wellhausen, a theologian in the 19th century, very heavily. But that's what he considers to be a proper relationship to God. Although he was an atheist himself, that would have been the proper relationship. Once you start to universalize and say, my God is not only the God of us, we are not only the chosen people, but everyone should recognize that this is the God of everyone. That was a fatal mistake for the Jews, and that was picked up by the Christians, because the Christians also consider God and Jesus to be the only God and the God of everyone. So that that was the way that Nietzsche looked at that relationship. So Judaism, or late Judaism, or later Judaism after the Second Temple, contributes to this Christianization of Europe, which is slave morality and the downfall and the rise of mediocrity. And so that's the way he's looking at that.
Very nice. So why I've met a lot of Jews that talk so well about Nietzsche and read his works, mostly in translation, and say, wow, this is something that I can understand. I can't understand others. I can understand Nietzsche.
Well, I can't speak for those. You'd have to ask those individuals exactly what they see, but I can say that after the Second World War, you had an attempt to kind of purge Nietzsche of any anti-Semitism and of any connection with the Third Reich, and that was undertaken by a very influential scholar named Walter Kaufmann, who was a professor at Princeton, who translated many of Nietzsche's works and wrote a book on Nietzsche that went through 4 printings and was read by everyone. And I think that he emphasized that Nietzsche always was against anti-Semitism, which is true. He was always against anti-Semitism as it was defined in his time. That doesn't mean that he didn't have anti-Jewish thoughts or retain anti-Jewish stereotypes, as I've tried to point out. But he definitely was against the anti-Semitism as it was defined in his time. Well, Kaufmann just kind of expanded that and said, well, he was against anti-Semitism. Look at all these text passages I can cite where he says, I hate anti-Semites. I want all anti-Semites shot. I'm against anti-Semitism. I'm disappointed in my sister because she's hooked up with one of the main anti-Semites, et cetera, et cetera. Those passages do exist, but Kaufmann doesn't go into enough what Nietzsche meant by that. That is, if you contextualize that, then you see that that doesn't mean that he doesn't harbor stereotypes of Jews and have some anti-Jewish motifs running through his thought. And I think that that's the reason that was the purging of Nietzsche. And one of the other things that Kaufmann did then was blame his sister for everything and said, if Nietzsche is known now and has been known by people in Germany and by Crane Brinton, the Harvard philosopher, and by others as someone who was an anti-Semite, the fault lies with his sister, who distorted his works and made him into a German nationalist and an anti-Semite. Totally false. Totally false. She never did that. In fact, she said in her writings that with regard to Nietzsche and Wagner, Wagner was the anti-Semite, which is true. Wagner was the anti-Semite. My brother was never an anti-Semite. And I have no reason to be anti-Semitic, even though I was married to Förster. So she, if you bother to read what she actually said, and if you bother to look at what she actually did to distort his works, it's very little in his actual writings. It's mostly in the letters. And the reason that she distorted it and the distortions that she made was to make them look closer in the 1880s than they actually were. It wasn't to make him look like an anti-Semite. She never did that, and there's no evidence of that at all. But people have looked at Kaufmann and read Kaufmann and then just picked that up and acted as if it were all true, and it's all Elizabeth's fault that Nietzsche was picked up by the Nazis.
So there was no attempt on her part to make Nietzsche sound better to Nazis in Germany in 1930s?
No. Of course, she did play up to the Nazis to a certain degree. That is, she met with Hitler. Hitler met with her. Hitler went to the Nietzsche archives. But if you read her remarks about Hitler, I mean, they're very naive. She was an old woman by that time. She was in her 80s. She didn't understand politics very well. She was not a member of the Nazi Party. Her in-laws were members of the Nazi Party. That is, people associated with the Nietzsche archives were members of the Nazi Party. She never was. She was a member of the Deutsche Nationalpartei. Bad enough, because that was a right-wing party. But she never joined the Nazi party, and she thought Hitler was using this Jewish stuff just in order to get elected, and that he didn't really mean that. And she writes that. She had very many Jewish friends of the Nietzsche archives that she cultivated. Her relationship to her brother and what she did afterwards has been distorted really by a lot of people who would like to see her as the kind of scapegoat for all of the ills that have befallen Nietzsche's reputation.
So when a Jew starts thinking about Nietzsche and his work and reading a little bit about it, what in your mind should he or she take as a lesson from Nietzsche's life and his works? I mean, what is there for Jew to even think about? I mean, just it's easier maybe to ignore him altogether.
Well, you could ignore him, but I think he's important for philosophy, because he calls into question a lot of the traditions in philosophy, a lot of traditions in German idealism. He's a very materialist philosopher, so he gives certain alternatives to the philosophical tradition that are important. I don't think that anyone should ignore his views on Jews or on women, for example. He had very misogynist views too. I don't think people should ignore that, but you can't take that as the whole of what Nietzsche represents. If you disqualified every philosopher who made anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic remarks, it would be a very thin field of philosophy. I mean, Hegel didn't talk at all times in a positive light about Jews, and or someone like Frege was an out-and-out anti-Semite. So if you're going to disqualify people because they made remarks about Jews or were anti-Semitic, then you're not going to have much of a philosophical tradition. I think you have to look at it in a more differentiated fashion and not excuse Nietzsche, as Kaufmann sought to do, recognize what he represents with regard to Jews and Judaism, but then see where he fits in with other things in the philosophical tradition and what might be of value.
Are you saying that a Jew, first of all, secular Jew, should, because a religious Jew cannot value Nietzsche, regardless whether he was pro-Nazi or not, and whether the Nazis took advantage of him, whatever it is, because Nietzsche had this attitude that idea of God, of Jewish God, was absolutely idiotic.
Right, and he also said God is dead, and that doesn't square very well with any religion.
With religion. So we're talking about the affinity for Nietzsche on the part, a possible affinity on the part of secular Jews.
Well, I don't want to contradict you, but there are many religious Jews who have found things worthwhile in Nietzsche as well. So it is.
Please contradict me. I mean, that's why I've invited you, because I find your work very, very interesting. And we find things interesting not because we agree with it.
Right. Well, I'm just saying, I think that there are, I mean, I know that there are quite a few Israeli scholars. I know that there are quite a few Orthodox religious scholars who have found things worthwhile in Nietzsche. So it isn't.
What do they see? What do they see of interest to them in Nietzsche?
Well, they see some of his, I guess, individualism, his perspectivism, those kinds of things, some of the concepts that he developed in his philosophy as being worthwhile and being consonant with things that they believe in as Orthodox Jews. So it's not, again, you have to be a little bit selective, and you have to ignore some things that Nietzsche said. I don't think anyone is going to say that Nietzsche was a religious man and that his views on religion or on God are able to be imported into an Orthodox framework,
or on the relationship,
philosophy.
or on relationship between races.
or on the
relationship of will to power,
right.
on relationship to Übermensch.
Well, it depends on how you interpret the Übermensch, and it depends on how you interpret the will to power. Some people interpret them in a very, let's say, mild or gentle Nietzschean fashion as self-assertion and self-acclamation, rather than as being setting oneself up in a hierarchy. So there are various ways that Nietzsche has been interpreted. I'm not saying I agree with them all, but there are ways in which Nietzsche has been interpreted that make him more palatable for Christian theologians, for Jewish Orthodox scholars, for Israelis. So those are things that I think occur. Again, I'm not validating those studies necessarily. I'm just saying that they do exist, and if you look in the literature, you will find Orthodox Jews who think Nietzsche has something to offer. Let's put it that way. They don't totally accept Nietzsche, but they think he has something to offer and he's valuable.
Your book is called Nietzsche's Jewish Problem, between Anti-Semitism and Anti-Judaism. I have a question. When you say Nietzsche's Jewish problem, is it a Jewish problem with Nietzsche or Nietzsche's problem with Jews?
I think it's rather more the latter. I think it's Nietzsche's problem with Jews. That is, he recognized in his Wagnerian period, but also then later on, that there was a Jewish question in Germany, that something had to be solved, that the Jews didn't have a homeland as many Germans thought, that they were intruders in some ways, that problem, and that they had developed other kinds of characteristics because of this, et cetera, that problem had to be solved. And so I think a lot of people who weren't radical anti-Semites recognized that there was a Jewish problem, and he offered some solutions for it, mostly through, as I said, intermarriage.
Basically,
so that was,
give up Judaism, become Christian, because otherwise you could not get married in Germany of that time unless in church.
That's something. He didn't go that far. He didn't go into the particulars. He just said Jews have some negative, repulsive characteristics. We all know that. His friend Franz Overbeck said that. Said Jews. Everyone who's educated knows that Jews are repulsive in some ways, and that we have to reject Jews. But we don't have to accept the anti-Semites solution, which is to take away citizenship and kick them out of the country. That's not the solution.
But there is a mild solution.
The mild solution is
mild solution: take away citizenship and kick out of the country.
Well, that's what happens, of course, under National Socialism. And that was the anti-Semitic parties in Germany in 1880 said, close off all the borders, don't let any more Jews in, and take away the citizenship rights of the Jews that are here.
But then it goes a little bit further. Let's just kill them all.
Well, that's what happens under Nazism, definitely.
So this is a step-by-step progression.
But Nietzsche did not want that solution, and neither did his friend Franz Overbeck or other people of the more educated. They rejected the anti-Semites as crude and said, what we have to do is integrate the Jews into society. The best way to integrate them is through intermarriage. That way the progeny are not going to have the negative Jewish characteristics, because those will be bred out of them in some way.
Very interesting. It was also the prescription of Marx and later Lenin.
It certainly was a common solution in the 19th century. Schopenhauer also had that solution of intermarriage.
Everybody saw the progress of humanity, and hallmark of it is disappearance of Jews.
Well, it would be a disappearance of Jews. I think Nietzsche wanted just as much a disappearance of Christianity.
Well, yes, I understand. By the way, he said some good things about Islam.
That's right. He said some good things about Buddhism too. So, I mean, his remarks.
Judaism and Christianity disappearance, but Islam triumphant, right?
Well, I wouldn't say triumphant. He saw some good characteristics in other religions, a more realistic religion. That's what he calls Buddhism, for example. That's a more realistic religion for him than Christianity and Judaism.
So what should I tell to my friends that ask me these questions? How should I think about Nietzsche? What should I do? I mean, he's an interesting guy. He's easier to read than Schopenhauer. I mean, what am I supposed to do with him?
Well, you tell them that, like all of their reading of philosophers, they have to read in a differentiated fashion. So you read and you figure out what is of value and what is not of value, and what has to be rejected on the basis of 19th century prejudices and 19th century stereotypes that inhere in the work. So that's the only thing you can do is to read people in that way.
So this sounds to me like a very good advice for individual people, individual Jews.
That's right.
The last and final question: what would be your advice to us as a nation? Because Nietzsche saw Jews as a nation,
right?
Which is one big plus for him, unlike many people in the United States who see Jews only as a religious association.
Well, seeing Jews as a nation has positive sides to it, but it also has negative sides to it, because a nation in Germany in the 19th century is connected with territory that it possesses. And so therefore, all the Jews who are in Europe are interlopers. They are living on territory that isn't theirs. So that characterization of
territory that they don't claim with force for themselves.
That's right. So that has a kind of a negative aspect to it too, being considered a nation rather than being considered a citizen, which is a more advanced way of, I think, thinking about it. That then you can be a citizen and you can have different religious views from your neighbors. But being considered a nation, that's as I said, that's a tricky point, because if you're a nation, what are you doing here on my territory? Well, this isn't your territory, and if you're a nation, you have to have territory somewhere.
I understand.
And
so
that's
when Italians come to Germany or to France, they are no longer Italians, huh?
That's right. Well, I don't know, but that was the Zionist solution too. The Zionists are a movement of the 19th century. That's what they believe too, that Jews need a homeland, right? They need territory.
So believed Bundists. The only thing that they believe that the homeland is where they are.
Yeah, but that of course was disputed by the government, which didn't consider them part of that nation. That was the problem. And so that's why I say that being considered a nation has positive aspects to it, but it also has these negative aspects to it. But I think that what Jews as a whole should take from Nietzsche are the same thing that what individual Jews should take. They should take the positive things, the questioning of certain philosophical traditions, some of the criticisms that Nietzsche has of Kant, for example. Those are things that should be considered and should be taken seriously. His remarks about Jews, even his positive remarks about Jews, sometimes have that kind of stereotypical aspect to it. That is, he'll talk positively about Jews and say, well, of course they know how to deal with money. That's one of the reasons that I'm so positive about.
And they can rule the world,
And they can rule the world. And he says that at one point. He said that if the Jews wanted, they could take over Europe. Well, that's an anti-Semitic trope from the 19th century. Obviously, Jews couldn't take over Europe, but he was still thinking about the Wagnerian notions and the anti-Semitic notions of the Jewish banking houses, that the Rothschilds and things like that. The Jewish press he talks about as well. So there are a lot of these motifs, anti-Semitic motifs, that come up in his writings, even when he's positive about Jews.
You know what I like about Nietzsche?
What?
He's one of the very, very few people that I have come across who is ideologically, at least in the last part of his life, in opposition to anti-Semitism as one of the central elements of his view of the world. I mean, most of other people who are not anti-Semites, they're just politically correct, anti-Semites. But Nietzsche, in some way, was ideologically committed anti-Semite.
Yes, he was a committed anti-Semite. But again,
no, I did not say anti-Semite.
You said
anti-Semite. That is, after the Christian social movement rose up in 1880-1881,
right?
Socialist, Christian socialists, and Nietzsche went against them in a principled way.
He definitely did. Well, of course, that was part of his anti-Christianity.
Yeah.
See? I mean, he felt that he felt that the anti-Semites were closer to Jews and Judaism than they knew. That was that was something that he wrote at one point in his notebooks.
Yeah, Nietzsche is a fascinating guy, and I'm very happy that you have given many years of your life to study him and to think about him. And I hope that many other people will follow you, at least in some way, and purchase your book. We're going to have the link to Amazon for your book, and hopefully they're going to be purchasing and reading it, not only purchasing, but reading it and thinking about it, because that is, in my mind, a very important segment of thinking as a human being, as a Jew.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. And thank you for the interview, for your thoughts. And I hope to talk to you maybe one day again.
I hope so. Okay. Thank you,
Have a
Alexander.
great day.
Yeah. Bye-bye.